Next up is Industry Perspective. We are pleased to have a lecture from Dr. Michael Macular, CEO of Rexel. Now, Dr. Macular, please come up to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Mike McCullough. I'm the president and CEO of Rexel. I'll start by thanking Professor Sakaguchi. Very grateful for his time and efforts. He still plays such a big role in the company with his vision and scientific leadership. And I'm very fortunate I get to see him on Zoom, maybe once or twice a week, but I'm always excited when I get to see him in person. He's not just a world-class scientist, he's really a tremendous human being, and we're very grateful for his time and his efforts. So I'm also grateful for the organizers who asked me to talk about Rexel, but specifically to talk in detail about our operating strategies that enable us to have a very effective US-Japanese operating footprint and think about how can we capture all the value from this world-class science that emerges from Japan. I'm also very grateful to be part of the Japanese ecosystem at such an exciting time. Usually when I talk about Rexel, I usually start the discussion by reminding people or informing them that Japan creates world-class science. It doesn't really matter how we measure it here. We can point to the quality and the depth of the academic institutions, but also this repeated transformational healthcare discoveries, such as the discovery of iPS cells, the foundation of cancer immunotherapy. And Professor Sakaguchi just talked about self-tolerance, and it doesn't really even get to the point describing the substantial numbers of Nobel laureates that originate from Japan, or the quality of the depth of the healthcare workforce in the scientific community. So I should just say a couple comments about my background that may give a little bit of context of some of my comments, and not made to be critical, of course, just my observations. And my background's a little bit different. I'm actually a toxicologist by training. There aren't many of us. Most of us don't get out of the lab, so I should be grateful for that as well. But my background, I'm very lucky. I was been put in different operating roles. Maybe the most interesting for this discussion, led in VP development in my career, several new drug approvals, and then went to business school really to be an operator, not a banker or a finance guy, but then involved in some really interesting strategic transactions, such as monetizing our commercial sales force. But one thing that was interesting and fortunate for me, I became an executive at Aztecs when we were acquired by Otsuka. And it was a great experience. I could see how complex deals get done. But also it was my first experience to see Japanese culture and Japanese science in Japanese management systems. And I stayed there for about a year. I left, I licensed a drug with my friends from Sanofi. And we formed another company that was then became very interesting. It was acquired 2 years later by Sumitomo, the Nippon Pharma. And then I was a bit more senior, so I had much more transparency into Japanese management systems and Japanese science. So it was a great experience, but I promised to stay for 4 years. And when that was over, people were scattering everywhere, and I was approached by UTech with this really great idea. They reminded me about the quality of Japanese science, but that the ecosystem here is not yet caught up to ensure the companies reach their full potential. But what if we were to find the best-in-class Japanese science, not really separate from Japan, but start to be mindful about addressing some of the constraints that perhaps have kept the ecosystem from reaching its full potential? And obviously there are things that are structural that we're always talking about. One of them, I think, was mentioned earlier, but historically, maybe not so much today, but the venture ecosystem in Japan is not quite developed to the same extent in the US, which meaning sometimes the funds are not large enough. So it's very difficult to finance Japanese life science companies to really meaningful inflection points. And then how we use IPOs in Japan is very different. In the US, we think of them as a financing event. Here, it's a really liquidity event. So Japanese companies don't really have access to follow-on financings in the public market, so it's a little bit constrained. And a lot of the capabilities and skill sets that we need in the ecosystem are still sequestered in companies like Takeda and Astellas, right? They're really available to small companies. And even then, sometimes when an executive or talent from Takeda Astellas joins a company like Rexel, their lens about how they solve complex problems is very different than how we might do it at a Rexel-sized company. And I think that struggles, they maybe be limited in their effectiveness, and that could be quite challenging. I think also, my experience, Japan creates world-class physicians, right? I always kind of joke about if I get sick, I hope it's in Japan because the doctors are such high quality, but doctors in Japan tend to work in hospitals. They don't really see them often in small companies. And I think what that means is when companies develop really interesting science, they tend to, in Japan, lean towards an IST. In the US, we think that's a little unusual, especially early on. You give up control of enrollment, you give up control of the protocol, you give up control of data. I think sometimes hard to monetize these things, and maybe companies struggle then to be organized to effectively execute a phase 2. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. Obviously, I think China has changed the perception of ISTs, but the China ecosystem is very different, right? We consolidate how we treat patients there into large centers, so they enroll very quickly. And even in China, some of the biotechs may have more expertise in clinical development to make the ISTs more effective, but that's very difficult. And other point that is interesting, or maybe also a constraint, is that in Japanese biotech, it's very unusual to strike a collaboration and deal with a large international partner. And it's not, to me, always about the cash, it's about access to capabilities. For example, we became a JLabs portfolio company last summer, and it's hugely helpful for us as we transition into a clinical stage company. We were very fortunate. We just received a second AMID grant a few weeks ago to expand our pipeline into other therapeutic indications, but also really to strengthen our process, our platform. And part of the discussions that enabled us to get that second grant were really from our discussions with our JLabs collaborators about how to leverage the platform in the most effective way. So that's quite rare in Japan. So the question then, at UTech, when I was approached, was how do we really address these constraints, but not really separate from Japan? We really think that we have major advantages from having science here, but finding ways to address these constraints. And I was also interested, are there quantitative differences between US and Japan in terms of seed and Series A financings? I used to think, are these really some form of spatial arbitrage or improperly priced assets? I don't know that that's true, but certainly there are clear differences. The one I pointed earlier to you, I think is maybe the most meaningful, is the median deal size. If we benchmark mine data from 2023 to now, and you look at the seed and Series A, $2.3 million financing isn't really enough to get companies to valuable, meaningful inflection points. And to me, that was really quite striking. And there are obviously differences too, but that to me was maybe the most meaningful. So I'm going to talk about people. And at the end of the day, we will compete for everything, right? We compete for investors, we'll compete for patients, we compete for attention, we compete for people, we compete for good ideas. And you compete based on capabilities, which really based on people. And I did mention to you before I became involved with RegCell, I was working as CEO in a company that was US in China. And it was almost instantaneously when I started the job, I was in over my head about how to navigate the differences between US and China. And I was reading everything I could, and I came across this paper. It was an HBR, and the paper was talking about these complexities that you manage across in geographical areas and how you make decisions. And what was striking to me, and I highlighted this, that some things make sense to us. They cluster certain areas, and you would understand those. For example, the US and Japan, but Japan is unique, right? And this really stuck with me even after I read the paper a few years ago. And it's now, as you spend more time in Japan, you'll know what this is like. And it's not a bad thing, it's just very, very different. You'll notice here we're trying to model behaviors based on decision-making in terms of consensus are from top down, or organizations hierarchical or the egalitarian. So in Japan, consensus thinking is very important, and it's really, Japan has a very sophisticated culture, and you see that in management systems as well, how we make decisions here. It's organized usually to make the best quality decision, but the challenge is things that you and I in the US might think as normal course of business can be quite paralyzing to organizations here. And then how do we think about organizing? In US, we are always thinking about a simplified, flat organization early on, and here we're really trying to get we're really in a race, right? We're converting cash to assets and cash to data to de-risk. That's how we think about it. In Japan, the very important for us in Japan is to think about the organization and how would you form departments early on. So we're always wondering about how can we bridge these two to really have the best of what's in the US and the best in what's in Japan. But decision making is very complicated, and it's really fascinating about how that works here. So at the end of the day, then we have to make some very difficult decisions, right? How do we organize? Because the concept here is how do we think about the company through the lens of a competitive advantage? And I messed up the slide. The reality is we should have the Japanese part on the left. And if you listen to how Professor Saguchi describes his science, obviously we feel strongly we have a major advantage in terms of our insights and foresights around immune tolerance, right? That fits the classification of a real competitive advantage. It's very rare. It's very difficult. I can't imagine replicating that somewhere else, right? And it really enables us to differentiate the company. So that is an advantage. And the question is, how do we organize around it to be able to solve for these, right? So obviously, we make a hard decision. We're thinking about how are we going to compete and really create as much value as possible. That means we look for other advantages. And for us, we have some technical advantages in our manufacturing. We don't have to edit cells or use viral DNA. So our process really is more amenable to automation and to point of care type of a platform. Those skill sets are much more attainable in the US as well as CDMO. So that's a foundation of one of the major objectives we had was to be able to do that. And as I mentioned, we are an early company, which means our first studies have to really enroll and we have to generate unambiguous data. The infrastructure in Japan is not quite ready to enable us to do that. We felt that's something we could probably execute better in the US, and that's gone pretty well. But clearly we have a major advantage in how we develop Treg biology and insights and foresights and tolerance. That's a major advantage for us. We have major advantages by having our operational footprint in science here in Japan. So that's why I should have put that on the left side and the US on the right side, because that's really how we think of it. So the other part about people, and people, as I mentioned, that's how we compete. We compete for everything and we compete based on capabilities, and that's really about people. And part of this is, I was very obsessed early on about culture. We have cultural differences, but it's not really about, putting core values and a mission statement. That just gets kind of boring and unoriginal. What we look for in values are behaviors, and what we're looking for values is finding ways to get people engaged. And these are hard jobs. My experience is that culture, values get engagement. Engagement gets persistence and resilience. And that's what correlates with success. In the US, it's kind of easy for us to think about that. When we recruit people, we're always talking to them about decision-making, making simple at the lowest level or working autonomously and aligning our incentives, right? And that's easy. Japan, I really want people in Japan to be also highly engaged because these are not easy jobs, right? And the culture is different. So it adds one level of complexity for us. The good thing, though, is we work in terms of engagement by incentives and getting those aligned. And obviously in the US, it's very tractable for us to get people engaged because we can be part of this idea of taking world-class science from Japan, working with Professor Sakaguchi. So that's gone very well. But here we're worried about autonomy, right? One thing that's really important for small companies is the ability to work autonomously. We don't have a lot of bandwidth. So people need to function autonomously and execute. And then I didn't talk much about decision-making. I mentioned earlier that when we have consensus-type systems, that is excellent for optimal decisions, but it could be quite paralyzing, right? Things that we might think of as normal course of business can really become to a standstill. So culturally, we're really learning how to enable people to be more confident in Japan about making decisions at a lower level. And here, that's really what we've been striving for. It's been easier in the US, but we're making traction there. But it's a big concept for us as we go forward about how do we create a culture, especially when we're small, right? When we're small, it's important because it's easy to control. When you get bigger, it's much more of a challenge. So then at the end of the day, we have to kind of consolidate everything into goals. We're very much goal-oriented at RegCell. It's a little bit of a constant tussle between the board and myself about goal setting. I always felt that 5 goals is core. It really forces you to think about what's most impactful. And also at this time, we were really thinking about how do we build a foundation. Company building is like building a house, right? We're starting on the foundation. So the first thing we wanted to do was really to develop in the US what we think of as a commercially viable process so we can automate the cells and get this into a point of care. That's gone really well. Our investors were really excited to restructure the company to become a US-based entity because it opens up access to lots of ecosystem resources and broader investor base. That went very well for us. That was done last year. And then here, the concept of how do we work effectively in terms of decision-making execution between Japan and the US. And then we're very fortunate. We just recently received a second IMID venture ecosystem grant. So we have access to almost $80 million of non-dilutive capital that enables us to have a very capital efficient way to get meaningful clinical data. That's a huge advantage for us. And then here, the concept is, how do we really think about taking this world-class science from Japan and wrapping it around efforts in the US to really address the constraints that have held back the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKellar.